Hi there, and welcome to Inside the Wooniverse, a podcast brought to you from the corner of Fringe and Maine. I'm your host, Colette Baron-Reid, and with me today is Dr. David Hamilton. David is a former R&D scientist, someone who used to develop drugs for cardiovascular disease and cancer. But guess what? He left the pharma industry to pursue his interest in the placebo effect. And this led him into writing and educating people on how to harness their minds and emotions to optimize their health. Now, David is the author of 11 best-selling books, including The 5 Side Effects of Kindness, awesome book, and How Your Mind Can Heal Your Body. And my very, very favorite, and all of our favorite here, Inside the Wooniverse, the book is called Why Woo-Woo Works. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here chatting with you today.
I'm so excited. So from pharmaceuticals to woo-woo, you truly are at the corner of Fringe and Maine, David. So let's start at the beginning. Were you always interested in science and spirit, or did you stumble into it?
I would say I've always been interested in it, but I think what happened is my mom had postpartum depression in the mid-1970s after my youngest sister was born. So I have 3 sisters. My youngest sister was born in the mid-70s. My mom had postpartum depression, but it wasn't very well understood at the time. In fact, one of the doctors told my mum to just give herself a shake. And, you know, I don't know what that was all about, but my mum didn't get the treatment that she needed, or
Yeah.
the best treatment, because it wasn't very well understood. And I remember, I was aware that my mum was suffering. She didn't really tell the children, myself and my 3 sisters. She wanted to, keep us free of that, but you can just tell. And I remember, I think it was my first week at high school. And this might sound a bit woo-woo, but a book fell off the shelf when I was in the library for the first time. And it was called The Magic Power of Your Mind by
Wow.
Walter Germain. And I immediately had this sense that can help my mum. I sort of just put it in my bag. I didn't know that when you're supposed to join a library and borrow books. We still have it. We still borrowed it, haven't given it back yet. But it totally helped my mum. It didn't cure depression in a day, but what it did is it gave her, tools and strategies and insights like meditation and visualization and affirmations, things that no one really knew about. Certainly in Scotland, where I grew up at that time. And they helped my mum to navigate a course through some of the really difficult days. So as I was growing up as a young teenager, my mum and I often had conversations about the power of the mind, because in that book was also, research in what we now call parapsychology and ESP and stuff. So my mum and I were fascinated by these topics. So we often talked about things right through my teenage years. And even when I did my PhD, I was so interested in these kind of topics that it was almost like a side interest to me. I went through the conventional academia and I ended up as an R&D scientist, as you pointed out. But I think because of this background interest I'd always had
Mm-hmm.
from the conversations with my mum, when I first saw evidence for the placebo effect in a clinical trial and drugs that I was involved in, while my colleagues were so fascinated and pleased at the success of the drug, I was just so amazed at the success of the placebo. And so I
Right.
began to research, how does the mind exactly, what is it that happens in the brain and the body when you believe or you think or you imagine something? And that really was my springboard out of the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh, wow. This is so fascinating. So why is it so powerful, the placebo effect? Why is that?
Well, when you believe something, to an extent, your your belief actually fiddles around with your brain chemistry. So what really happens is your brain begins to produce these substances that it needs to produce to move you in the direction of what you believe is going to happen. So within reason, of course, but things like, pain, for example, if someone has headache pain or pain somewhere in their body and they take a placebo, but they believe it's a real pill, then the brain manufactures its own painkiller. So the brain has its own version of morphine, for
Right.
example. And so the brain will manufacture morphine simply because you believed. But here's the thing, if you had pain in your left knee, then the brain doesn't manufacture its own morphine everywhere. It only
Right.
manufactures it in the small region of the brain connected to your left knee. So it's not just the brain produces what it needs to produce to meet your expectation, for example, but it also produces what it needs to produce exactly where it needs to
Wow.
produce it. So it's your own mind and your awareness of what's wrong and what needs to happen that's guiding the changes in your brain chemistry. And I thought that was amazing.
Well, I think it's still amazing. So
Yes, it was, yeah.
let's play with this conversation a little bit because I think it's fascinating what you said. So it's all about specificity, right? So if you're very specific about your belief that, oh, this pill is going to fix this knee, and then you're just saying all the chemistry and all the, the cascade of chemicals goes directly to the knee because you actually manufactured it. So it's like you're a mini universe inside of you that can make whatever it needs. So if you look at the body as an example of, the universe is as the body, right? So, and then if you take this same exact idea that you're talking about how you can heal your body and apply it to the energy external to you. Tell me about that.
I see the world that we experience really in some ways as an extension of the body. And so just like your beliefs and your state of consciousness fiddles around with the chemistry inside your brain and body, it's like it fiddles around with the chemistry of your life. But
Right.
instead of molecules, hormones, and enzymes, you've got people and events and circumstances. But it seems as if the same sort of a principles organizing nature of your mind impacting the world seems to be in some ways a reflection of the way it happens inside the body. I believe it is similar.
Right. So now I want to talk about kindness because I think that is kindness and the placebo effect. And you moved from that. That was a really important book of yours. Let's talk about the effect of kindness because we're really looking at the effect.
Yeah, so kindness has a large number of effects inside the brain, in your heart, your immune system, even in some of the internal biological processes of aging. And it's not being kind itself that does it, it's how kindness feels. One
Right.
thing I often teach is that physiologically, speaking, kindness is the opposite of stress. I mean, I often ask live audiences, what's the opposite of stress? And people will start shouting out, it's calm, it's peace, it's tranquility. And I would, at one point in my life, I would have given a similar answer. But in actual fact, peace and calm and tranquility, they're not the opposite of stress. They're the absence of stress.
Wait, let's go back there. I want to repeat this again. This is very important what you said. So you said, again, I want to underline this, that calm is not the opposite of stress. It is the absence of stress. This is very, very important that kindness, the experience of kindness is the opposite of stress. Let's dive right into that.
The feeling of stress is what produces stress hormones. Adrenaline, cortisol. Most people have heard of stress hormones. It's not being in a stressful situation that produces those. It's how the stressful situation feels. Like two people can be in the same situation. You're stuck in traffic, for example. One person feels stressed, and as a consequence of feeling stressed, they will have stress hormones produced in the brain and body. But the friend beside them is going, just chill out, relax. Don't worry about it. The stressed person wants to hit them. And because they're not feeling stressed, there's not any production of stress hormones. So the situation itself doesn't really matter all that much. It's how each person feels about the situation. So coming back to kindness, it's not the act of kindness, it's the experience of kindness, what that feels like, the connection that you get with a person or even an animal. And it's how that feels that generates not stress hormones. I call them kindness hormones. And I call them kindness hormones to draw that parallel because they are opposite effects. It's like a seesaw. And one of the most amazing things research shows is that when kindness goes up, stress comes down. It doesn't mean that stressful things don't happen when you're being kind. It's the experience of kindness takes the sting out of the stressful events and the physical sting as well. So they just don't feel the same. They don't hurt the same. So kindness in many ways, physiologically, for example, stress increases blood pressure, but the experience of kindness reduces blood pressure. But some of the most amazing effects, I think, are inside the brain. Like, we know that the experience of kindness regularly actually causes physical change in the structure of the brain, just like stress does. It's like if I go to the gym and work out a muscle, then the muscle gets firmer and larger.
Right.
Something similar happens in the brain, but we don't call it muscle growth. Neuroscientists like to sound a bit cleverer, so we call it neuroplasticity. But the idea is similar. So if I did mindfulness, in other words, I breathe and notice that I'm breathing, so therefore I'm being mindful of my breathing, I then work out this frontal part of the brain above my eyes and it takes it to the gym. So undergoes that physical change. But instead of doing mindfulness, if I instead do what I call kindfulness, so instead of your
Kindfulness.
attention being on your breathing, your attention is on kindness and the experience of kindness. So you might be thinking kindly of a person. You might even recall an experience you had when someone gave you something that made you feel good, or you did something kind for someone. But that experience works out this frontal part of the brain, but there's a slight bias to the left hand side and a slight bias slightly deeper in as well. Now, these are regions of the brain associated with happiness and joy and even spiritual states of consciousness. So, what that ultimately means is as we work out these brain regions, they become more powerful and it becomes therefore easier to extract happiness and joy out of the backdrop of everyday events and circumstances of our lives. It just becomes easier to experience the positive because of how kindness feels.
I love that. And it's not that you're trying to control the outer at all, right? That's not it at all. You're not even engaged with the outer. You're holding space for this feeling state. Is this kind of like gratitude? Like when you practice being thankful? Is it a similar, or does that hit different parts of the brain?
Very similar, because when you're being thankful of something, what you're doing, yet many times you're immersing yourself also in the experience of kindness because you're grateful, for example, perhaps for the fact that someone said or did something really nice for you. So what you're actually recalling and experiencing that moment is what kindness feels like. And you're grateful for it. So some of these same things happen inside, the brain and inside the body. Some of my favorite effects of kindness is how it affects the heart. Kindness, because of how it feels, actually has a physical effect in your blood vessels. Like it kind of reduces the tension in the arteries and overall reduces blood pressure. That's what kindness hormones do. They park on the lining of our blood vessels. They cause them to release in tension. The blood vessel expands. The heart doesn't have to push as hard to get the blood through. So you get an easing of blood pressure. So kindness hormones are called cardioprotective, and that means they protect your cardiovascular system.
Wow.
So any way of producing them, i.e. just being kind, is also cardioprotective, and I absolutely love that.
So we could actually use that as a kind of a practice. A kindness could be a practice, like your meditation practice, instead of just the mindfulness practice. But being kind is actually an awareness, right? A feeling state of awareness. You're practicing that. Anything that we rehearse often enough becomes our primary state of being. As you know, and right now the whole world is rehearsing stress, right? And fear, stress, I don't get it. Like there's a lot going on. And then I think it's really a discipline, what you're talking about. But tell me about the negative bias or the nocebo a little bit, just because we have to acknowledge that there is, that we're being, I think that the conditioning that a lot of people are going through is like a nocebo. Do you not agree with me?
Yeah, so a nocebo effect is, in a sense, like the opposite of the placebo. Nocebo actually comes from the Latin "I shall harm," whereas placebo comes from the Latin "I shall please." And so, where expecting an improvement is the placebo effect can cause an improvement, expecting something negative
Right.
is what we'd call a nocebo effect, sorry. And so it's the expectation itself that increases stress in the body, that increases the seeming negative symptoms of something. Nocebo effect doesn't cause any harm, but it makes it feel like it is. It can generate symptoms of something. The difference between placebo and nocebo is the direction of what you're expecting to happen.
Right.
And it's your expectations, your belief that's driving it.
Right. So if you look at the outer world and allow that outer world to dictate your state of being, right, then you're going to have an effect that's directly related to the outer experience. So, we have to actually make a choice. Right, that the practice of kindness is a choice, and it can be a discipline, because if we exercise that muscle enough, that will be the stronger muscle. That's the one that we feed then, and then it's going to have huge effects everywhere. Oh, I'm so excited. Okay, now can we talk about something else now? Can we talk about the science behind visualization? I teach visualization. It's, my guided, vision journeys and meditations, etc. But I'd love to hear about the science. I'm a total geek and I want to know.
So in many ways, your brain doesn't really distinguish all that much between whether something's real and imaginary. One of my favorite studies in visualization was a Harvard study. It's affectionately known as the piano study. And volunteers basically played a sequence of 5 notes on a piano for a couple of hours on 5 consecutive days. I mean, you're not playing continually. You play the notes, for a minute or so, you rest for a minute, you play the notes, you rest, but on and off for a 2-hour period. And they had their brain scanned every day. And the region of the brain connected to the finger muscles that they'd been using to play the notes had grown in size by about 30 to 40 times. And it's called, as we spoke a moment ago, it's called neuroplasticity. It's the brain's version of muscle growth. But a separate group of people during that time, instead of playing the notes with their fingers, they played the notes with their mind. It's called kinesthetic imagery. So what they did, they closed their eyes, and they imagined what it would feel like to play the notes with their fingers. So they had to imagine the movement. They could visualize it, but also imagine imagine what it would be like to physically play those notes in the fingers for the same period of time. And amazingly, after the 5 days, they had the brain scanned. Well, the brain scanned every day. But on the 5th day, you put brain scans side by side and you couldn't tell the difference. The same region of the brain in those who'd imagined had also grown by a factor of 30 to 40 times. And if you put the scans side by side, you really can't tell who was in which group. I mean, in other words, under those conditions, the brain wasn't distinguishing between real and imaginary. That type of technique now of visualizing like that has been helped thousands of people who've had stroke, even some spinal cord injuries. It's been applied to even professional sports people. Most elite athletes now use that knowledge, that if you visualize, it isn't just something that sort of feels nice and makes you better at something. There's actually a physical change in the structure of the brain, which then impacts the way in which the body behaves and moves as well.
Wow. That is the coolest thing. And that is so amazing, because imagine all the different ways this could work. You know what's really funny? That's one of the reasons I won't watch horror movies. I know people think I'm nutty, but I don't want to imagine that. Like, I don't want to imagine. I want to only imagine happy. Like when I'm watching, I don't want to see anything really awful. Okay, so let's talk about the science behind the effectiveness or influence of crystals. I love crystals. I have so many crystals. I'm a total crystal bunny. Tell us about that.
Right, so well, I wrote a chapter on crystals. It turned out it was the largest chapter of the book. Actually, I was surprised at how much there was to say from a scientific perspective. Now, there hasn't been clinical trials on crystals, but you don't really have to. There's a lot that science can say. I mean, and there's actually 3 ways that I wrote that crystals can have an impact. The first way is actually harnessed by the Buddhist practice of Dzogchen. So Dzogchen is a teaching in Buddhism where they use a clear quartz crystal, and what the crystal serves is what's called a mental representation. Now, we know in cognitive psychology that a mental representation is just something that represents, that stands for something else. So the clarity of the crystal represents, or it stands for, if you like, the clear state of mind or the clear state of being that the practitioner wishes to attain. And for thousands of years, that has helped umpteen Buddhist practitioners to help to attain a clearer state of being. So when we work with crystals, if you're using a clear crystal, then because the clarity of the crystal also for a person who's meditating with a crystal, it's how I use crystals. The clarity for me represents, it stands for a clear state of mind. And what a mental representation does is it helps you to move towards it, because that's how the brain works, through mental representations. It's why visualization of the piano study, it's why what you're visualizing isn't, you're not actually playing the piano keys, but you have a mental representation in your mind that's causing neurological change in your brain. If you close your eyes and create a mental representation of a biting into a lemon, at least 50% of the population will salivate.
Yeah.
Now, you're not biting a lemon, you're just creating a mental representation of it. The second way I argued that crystals impact us is the colours, because we know from colour psychology that colour impacts us in a multitude of different ways. In fact, even neurologically. In fact, one of my favourite colour studies is volunteers were given a cherry flavoured drink, but the scientists coloured it lime green. So they put a little dye in it.
Yeah.
Do you know 37% of people couldn't taste cherry at all?
Wow.
And they swore that what they were drinking was lemon or lime flavoured. In other words, the brain processed the flavour based on what it should be, given its colour, rather than what it actually is. So what I argued is just like we know in colour psychology, if I wear, a particular colour one day because the colour helps me, because we know from colour psychology that blue, for example, can be a calming colour. And greens are more kind of natural, organic kind of things. Yellows can make you feel cheerful. We know that from life itself, but color psychology also tells us these. So I argued that the color of crystals, depending on how we're using them, can also elicit some behavioral and emotional changes, just like the way marketers, for example, use color to elicit behavioral changes.
Wow, that's so cool. And the third, I know that this is a huge chapter in your book. And then number 3, you have a number 3.
I argued that, and there is some beginnings of research in this kind of field, but I argued that the magnetic properties of crystals
Right.
also have an effect. So quartz crystal, it has a property that's known as diamagnetic. Now, what that means is if something is diamagnetic, it means that it diverts the Earth's magnetic field. Well, here's a good wee analogy. If I was standing outside and it was pouring with rain, I could
Yeah.
put an umbrella up. And what the umbrella would do is it would divert the path of the rain off of me, and it would go round the umbrella and it would dump it all onto someone unfortunate soul standing beside me, who would now get twice as wet because they would get my share of rain.
Right.
So something that is diamagnetic, what it does is it's not rain it's diverting, it's the Earth's magnetic field. So as the Earth's magnetic field's coming round it, it's like an umbrella and it pushes the Earth's magnetic field to the side. So anything a lot close to a crystal gets much more of the Earth's magnetic field than the inside of the crystal itself. Whereas some crystals are paramagnetic, and what that means is it pulls the Earth's magnetic field into it like a funnel, and it deprives of it on the outside. So the question I posed was, do these little fluctuations in the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field, do they actually matter? Well, there's been a heck of a lot of research recently on the impact of the Earth's magnetic field on plants, and it's actually called plant magnetoreception. The reason for the interest is NASA is looking seriously at, could we grow crops on Mars or even on the moon? Could we grow crops on a space station? Now, there's different magnetic field strengths in these places, so they want to study what's the impact of increasing or decreasing the Earth's magnetic field. Will that make plants go faster or slower? And it turns out that, like an increase, for example, that you would get from a diamagnetic substance, some types of plants will grow faster. Other
Wow.
types of plants will grow slower. Some will end up with more chlorophyll, more green, and others will end up with less. And it depends on the genetics of the plant. But there's no question, recent research is now suggesting and saying we think they're actually affecting the growth rate of plants. Now, here is a diamagnetic substance, a quartz crystal. Now, yes, there's not been any scientific studies on what happens when you hold a crystal, and I pointed that out in the book. But what I did say is I don't think we can rule it out. I think I don't know how strong the effect is, but I think there probably is some effect from a diamagnetic substance in close proximity to the body.
And would you not say also, if you believe that impacts, right, there you have that effect also, if you
Even
are
stronger.
being willing to be open-minded to it. Obviously, these new
Absolutely.
scientists are doing that. They're looking at it to do with plant growth, and that means that they might be able to manipulate it. In other words, make plants grow faster in different environments, like you said, on Mars. That's fascinating that NASA's looking into it.
Essentially, that's what they're looking to do, is understand the phenomena better. No research has been done on the human body, as far as I know, but I don't think we can rule it out. And as a scientist, I have a huge curiosity
Of
for this kind
course.
of thing. I'm very, very open-minded, which is why I started researching this.
And that's why your book is called Why Woo Woo Works, I know. And let's talk about the heart and our biofields and coherence. What does the latest science say about coherence and the benefits in connecting our hearts and minds?
Yeah, so a coherent state of mind, a coherence is like if you get up from your chair, but then you change your mind half the way in between and you sort of hover between getting up and sitting back down. That's what many people's heart rhythms are like most of the day. Not your actual heartbeat, but if you look at the beat to beat variance, it's called heart rate variability, and that really is the beat to beat variance. So if you breathe in, for example, your heart rate will speed up a little bit, and if you breathe out, it will slow down a little bit. And the difference, and that small difference in the beat to beat between speeding up and slowing down, that's called heart rate variability. And it's fairly predictable, but it's bigger if you would just, for example, if I was just to get up or just sit down, just make a decision, just get up cleanly or sit down cleanly. That'd be a coherent movement, right? But instead, most people, when they're under stress, they kind of hover between the up and down. And what you get if you look at the heart rate variability on a computer screen, it looks like a jagged line, like a mountain range. But if instead you just give some attention to your breath, and even just notice that you're breathing, but put your attention on the area of your heart, which begins to bring in, the idea of kindness and compassion,
Right.
then what you start to get is the beat-to-beat variation in your heart rate becomes very smooth. Instead of it being jagged, it becomes very clean and very smooth. It's like every part of the heart is operating together. Like it's like that analogy, you've either made a clear decision to get up or you've made a clear decision to sit down. Now, what that also does is that begins to inform the brainwaves. So what you begin to see is brainwaves, to an extent, begin to fall into sync with the heart. And what's happening now is the heart, having a larger magnetic and electric field, begins to inform the brain a little bit. And so what you get is called entrainment. And so what you're really looking for is that clear state. But what's really interesting, from the perspective of someone doing, a therapist of any form, I've talked about Reiki, hands-on healing in the book, but it wouldn't really matter. Any therapy, anytime you're in close proximity to someone, if you're in a state of coherence, then what research is beginning to show is the more coherent you are, you actually begin to impact the other person's heart state. And it's actually called the natural healer effect. And what natural healer effect means is I'm not actually trying to affect your heart in any way. I'm just being peaceful or kind and compassionate. And the natural effect of my presence is now beginning to move you towards a more calm, peaceful state that lends itself towards healing. That's why it's called the natural healer effect.
That's incredible. So it then reminds us that that before we work with somebody, like a healer works with somebody, they have to get coherent to have the best experience. When you enter into a situation with somebody else and your energy's all over the place, that also makes the impact. So what I'm getting from this entire conversation is that really that we go back to kindness and compassion as your primary goal on a day-to-day basis, because that's going to impact every single thing. It'll bring you into that state of coherence as well as enabling that entrainment. Okay, so I want to talk about entanglement now. So let's go from entrainment to entanglement. Okay, so because a lot of people, I think the idea that this is woo-woo because people are still very much engaged in the idea of separation, right? And that's nobody's fault. We physically see this, you're over there, I'm over here, blah, blah, blah. And we don't recognize this invisible field, which is what I want to talk about, this field in which we're entangled. Let's talk about that now.
Yeah, so for me in the book, I argue that consciousness is the basis of reality, and we are therefore all connected through a field of consciousness. And although it might sound odd for a scientist to say that, given physics isn't really interested at the moment in that kind of stuff, but a lot of the research in the field of psi, PSI, it's like an umbrella term for ESP, parapsychology, presentiment, all prayer, distant healing, all these kind of things. For me, there's no question that there's a real psi effect, right? And I know that in the mainstream of science, we tend to be dismissive of that. And the people that are dismissive of it, most of them, it's not because you're experts in it and you know whether that's true or not. It just doesn't sound plausible, and it can't really be plausible. In the mainstream, there are a lot of psychologists, physicists, every field of science believe that consciousness is just an illusion, or that it's produced by chemistry in the brain. And if you follow that path, then it can't possibly be a psi effect. So I believe, given the data, there's no question for me and people researching in the field that there's a psi effect. So therefore, I think we have to move away from that idea that consciousness is produced by the brain. So given the main ideas, we're only left with two options based on the main philosophies. And one is something called panpsychism, the idea that particles have consciousness. And I'm not suggesting that an atom in my couch sits back and enjoys watching Netflix on a Friday night. But the more rudimentary you go, everything has experience. If you write down to the smallest things, all we can do is refer to the equations that they satisfy. In other words, physics can tell us, and I know this because I'm, in the 5th or 6th years of a formal academic degree in physics and mathematics, just out of curiosity. And the best we know at the moment is called the hard problem of consciousness. We know what consciousness does. So we know what the brain or consciousness does, but we don't know what it is. So
Right.
we know that there's something there, but we don't know what it's like. We don't know what it's like to have we can't explain what it's like to have an experience. We can just say what the brain is doing while I
Right.
have an experience, but that's not the same as having the actual experience. So it's called the hard problem of consciousness. So panpsychism attempts to solve that. But the other one that attempts to solve it is called idealism. And it's the idea that a field of consciousness is actually the foundation of all of reality. And this is very consistent with the Eastern ideas of non-duality and stuff. And I argued in the book that idealism or panpsychism or something in between the two, for me, is the foundation of reality. And therefore, it means that everything is consciousness, and therefore everything is connected or entangled, if you will, through consciousness. And I would even argue, although, most physicists would disagree, but I would argue that maybe the many of the phenomena we see in the physical world are really just mirrors of the same sort of phenomena that we see in consciousness. For example, entanglement, the fact that it exists as a physical phenomena. If you can take two particles, separate them by trillions of miles, and you can ping one of them, and immediately the state of the other one is correlated with it. You can't send information from one to the other, but they are the state is connected. They're entangled in consciousness. And I think that's why things like prayer and distant
Yeah.
healing work. And that's why I believe there's an effect of psi, because everything is already connected. And
Yeah.
I argued in the book that the strength of connection increases when you feel love or empathy or emotional warmth. And that seems to be what some of the research shows. Studies in psi, where the protocol of the study allows for people to generate an emotional connection, the psi effect is always stronger than if the protocol takes out the emotional connection altogether. Because in science, we're overly trying to understand it, so we're making it too clinical. So what we often do is take out emotional connection because we think it's all about intention. And what happens is there a very weak or no psi effect sometimes. And the strongest effects are when we feel warmth, empathy, love, compassion, some form of felt connection. And so I would say that is the formula, if you will, that underlies impacting things at a distance, impacting life, impacting the world, is having a sense of warmth and felt connection with each other, with things. And that's when you begin to see this kind of effect.
Oh, it's amazing. That's actually my favorite part of the book, by the way, because, I'm a skeptical person. I had a hard time accepting that I was a medium because I was hearing all these things. I could tell the stories, etc. And I'm like, where's this coming from? Like, how am I getting all of this? And then I would know things and I would see things out of time, space continuum. And I didn't understand how that went. And I was always looking for an understanding, like, explain this to me, somebody, right? But if you look at it, the consciousness or the panpsychism or idealism model, that does explain it when you say consciousness is fundamental to all things. And my belief as an animist too, like I see everything having a presiding, some kind of consciousness. And for me, it's more spiritual. But, and I love that you said it's not that the atom is sitting on your couch watching Netflix saying, pass the popcorn. But we don't know. But we don't know that. We don't know that, do we?
No.
We don't.
No.
We have no clue. So, but it does explain a lot of the psi phenomena and a lot of the phenomena that mediums and intuitives and psychics and people experience, all the time, that never had any understand and any scientific explanation of it.
Yeah, for me, I've always had that curiosity, and as a scientist, I wouldn't rule anything out just because it doesn't sound plausible. For me, I've always been curious, and so I wanted to understand and investigate all the psi phenomena. And to me, it does make sense from an idealism or a panpsychism. That's why in the book I said I believe that something in between idealism. And so what I argued is that everything is animated with consciousness. So yes, consciousness is the basis of reality, but everything itself is also animated. Every particle has consciousness. So that's why I argued that I think something in between idealism and panpsychism is probably true.
I even feel like books are alive. Like once they're, even my oracle cards, I just feel that they have their own consciousness too. Like the concept of consciousness being independent from, from inanimation, right? Like I don't believe there's anything inanimate ever, anywhere.
Of course it has consciousness. Any
Right?
seemingly inanimate object. So maybe, I believe it's entirely possible to focus your attention. And this is what, if I'm saying a prayer for someone,
Mm-hmm.
what I do is I actually try to feel connection. I try to feel inside the person, and I try
Mm-hmm.
to heal and visualize and say the prayer from actually like that, almost a sense of feeling connection with, on the understanding that we are both animated by the same consciousness. We're both part of the same consciousness. So of course I should be able to do this. And I use that as almost a belief effect for myself. And I
Oh,
imagine almost sensing the internal conditions. And so when I say a prayer, it's not just a please God make John better.
yeah.
It's more of a, it's more of a please help me to understand and be such a connection, and help me to see what I can do.
And the prayer too, when you think of that, I say a prayer, relieve me of the bondage of self so that I may better do thy will. Make me a channel for thy
Oh,
peace,
wow.
right? So it's like get rid of, kind of move my little ego mind aside because it's not about me, right? And let me be the channel, like be a clear, like the clear quartz, like the Buddhist work with the quartz. It's so interesting. So, I pulled a card before I got on the call with you today, and it was called Mending. It's from well, you and I will pull one in a second anyway, but it's the subject of forgiveness. And there's a lot going on these days where a lot of people project negativity to each other, etc. We live in pretty fraught emotional times.
Mm.
And how can we use kindness? Would you say that forgiveness as well, that kindness, compassion, and forgiveness somehow operate around the same frequency?
Absolutely, exactly. They're almost just like different facets of the same crystal, if you like.
Right.
Different aspects of the same thing, the same feeling, the same overall state of consciousness, if you will. So, I mean, this is what I try to practice in my life. Kindness isn't so much just something that you do as a physical thing. It's
Mm-hmm.
something you try to embody in how you think about people,
Right.
and how you even interpret people's actions. Uh, trying to look past the clouds, if you will, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to understand that everyone is just trying the best they can, given the knowledge and experience and background. We're all just in some ways children trying to find our way home,
Oh, I
if you
love
like.
that.
And yeah, and sometimes we stumble along, we go left when
Mm-hmm.
probably we'd be better going right. But so how can I judge someone who's turned left rather than right? So what I try to do as my spiritual practice is to give people space, but just love
Right.
them. And just try, and for me, I would say, if this actually something extraordinary happened when I lost my dog Oscar about 7 years ago. He'd opened me up so much. He'd literally opened my heart so wide. I'd literally he's my best friend. I was we did everything. My partner and I did everything we could to save his life. He had bone cancer, and he was in my life for the entire duration of the time I was working on writing a book on self love. And I believe that Oscar came into my life 2 days before I started writing the book, and he passed away 2 days before I finished. It was like, I believe he came into my life for that purpose,
Uh-huh.
to heal me so that I could
Yeah.
become what I needed to become. And he burst me right open. And I remember when he passed away, I remember my partner Elizabeth said, "Where's all the love going to go?" And I realized that it's not going to go anywhere. What happened is I felt I'd opened up so wide that all the love and affection and warmth, rather than closing down again, it felt like it just attached itself to everything. And ever since that day, it's never left me. I have this background feeling, like it's like a gently simmering, lightly effervescence of affection for every single person I see, people from my past, people I just glance in the street. And I tap into that as a daily practice, where I just try to see the best in people and try to cut people some slack, try to forgive people if it's necessary, just try to feel gentleness and compassion as a way of being,
Oh, I
really.
love this. You want to know what? This is pretty amazing because my husband had the identical experience when our dog Beanie died. And he's never been the same man since. He became a nicer person after that because he loved that dog so much. He fell apart and I've never seen him like that in my life when we had to take Beanie to, she died in his arms. And, and to see that man break open like that was just, first of all, it was the most heartbreaking thing, but then it was the most extraordinary thing because ever since then he has more capacity, just like what you said. Where does the love go? Well, the love, you're broken open so you can hold more.
Yeah.
And I really understand that to be true. So I think that, we tend to want to escape and bypass loss and grief, etc. But those are things that may hurt us, but they're really important to dive in and to accept because we can become better people as a result of it. So let me talk about anxiety for a second because a lot of people are experiencing anxiety today. Do you have any technique that you love that you would suggest for people with anxiety?
Anxiety is something I've struggled with on and off almost all my life, actually. I've been quite open in my books about my own challenges with mental health. And, I've experienced depression twice in my life. But anxiety has been something that kind of comes and goes, even like now. No, not this moment, but it comes and goes in my life. But one thing that can almost nip it in the bud very, very quickly is an experience of kindness.
Kindness again.
Yeah. And what happens, the area of there's actually a cool bit of science on it that I use to rationalize this, is the part of the brain that's active when you're feeling anxiety. It makes you feel separate and closed, and it pulls all the blood supply away from the frontal regions of the brain, which we really want to be using at the time. And what happens is research shows that kindness hormones, what I call kindness hormones, they actually turn down the intensity of that anxiety region of the brain. It's called the amygdala. And research, they put people inside MRI scanners and put them in a kind of fearful state and watch the activity of the amygdala. And then they introduced kindness hormones through a nasal inhalation. And immediately, it was like turning a dimmer switch down. The intensity of that anxiety region of the brain began to rapidly diminish in proportion to the amount of kindness hormones given. So what I do, my little go-to technique is I just close my eyes and I try to recall an experience of kindness. Or if it's something recently, I can just go to someone who showed me kindness. And I think for a moment, how beautiful, how amazing, what a lovely thing to say, or a lovely thing to do, or a lovely email to have sent, or, a lovely, someone sang my happy birthday down the phone line. And it was when it was my birthday a few months, and it was such a lovely thing. Or I might even recall when I did something kind for someone and I recall the gratitude that they felt, And so any way of accessing the experience of kindness produces kindness hormones. But what we know in science is they turn down the activity of that anxiety region of the brain, like you're turning down a dimmer switch in your house because the light is too bright.
I love that. Okay, I want to go back to this one thing you said about snorting the kindness hormones. Okay, so what do you mean that they stuck something up people's noses?
Okay, so you can't eat or drink kindness hormones. I mean,
what are they? What are they called?
Well, the main one is oxytocin. It's a female reproductive hormone.
Oh.
And now they cross the blood-brain barrier through a nasal inhalation. Now you can't eat or drink them, but the way to get it into the brain is, it's like, the people take these little squirts when their noses are blocked.
Right.
So it's called a nasal inhalation, and it's just a fine mist. And what it does, oxytocin is just a small molecule, and it absorbs across the blood-brain barrier. So the only way to get it into the brain is through a nasal inhalation or an injection or something like that. And what I say to people as well, I think it's quite funny, is kindness hormones also slow the aging process.
Oh, they do.
I say to people,
anti-aging. That's why you want to be kind.
But you can't put them in a green drink. You can't eat them or drink them. The only way to get them into your cells is by producing them through the kind of person that you're being.
Okay, what is the wildest thing you've ever experienced researching the woo-woo?
Oh, wait, this will blow you away. I remember one day, right? I was writing a blog from my website. I write weekly articles, post them on my website. And I was writing one that I remember, it felt like when I was almost finished, I thought, I've just described what feels like the science of the Matrix film.
Ooh.
And while I was writing it, I remembered that I'm giving a lecture in a few days' time. I've forgotten to order some of my books. I often take some of my books to live lectures. People like to get them signed and stuff. So, and I'd forgotten, and I thought, I better order, because there's a midday cutoff. If you order past midday, you don't get them the next day. So it was about 11:30. I phoned up. I spoke to a woman in customer care called Michelle, and she took my order of about 100 of my books, of a few different copies of different titles. Anyway, I was writing the blog, and I suddenly remembered that I needed a reference from a book. And the book is by a very famous physics professor in the UK called Professor Brian Cox. And it's called Why Does E = MC Squared? And it's all about Einstein's relativity. As I said before, I'm most way through a mathematics and physics degree. I'm just out of curiosity. I just love the science, and mathematics is like my favourite subject. And I thought I needed a reference for the blog. And I remember it was one of Einstein's equations, and it was in that book. And I was just going to write it down as a footnote. And I couldn't remember where the book was. And I remembered then that I'd left it in storage. We were moving house at the time. And I remember at that moment, I really need that book. And I put my arms up and I beseeched the universe in a way that I do for fun. And I went, I really need that book. I really need that book. And I did it for fun. When I do that, I imagine columns of light coming out of my hands, going up into infinity. And I go, I need that book. I need that book. And I was just making light. I sometimes called God the big man. I go, I need that book, big man. Anyway, I got on with writing the blog, and I thought, well, I don't have the book, so I can't put the footnote in. So I uploaded the blog, and I thought, I've just described the science of the Matrix in the best way I've ever done. Press upload. Seconds later, literally seconds later, I got a phone call from my Hay House, or same publisher, from Hay House, the distributor, who had placed the order with half an hour earlier. And she said, look, David, I'm so sorry, but there's been, wait for it, a glitch in the system. Remember the line from the Matrix?
Matrix, yeah.
The glitch in the Matrix, it happens when they change something. I think it was Trinity said that. And she said, there's been a glitch in the system. I don't know how it happened, and this has never happened, but somehow the warehouse haven't dispatched all of your books. They've only dispatched 10, and you'll get those tomorrow. I'm so sorry you won't have a book in time for your lectures. And I said, look, Michelle, don't worry about it. It was my fault. I should have ordered the books weeks ago. I always leave it to the last minute. And I made a joke about it. I goes, I take full responsibility for this. Please don't worry at all. Nothing to do with you. I made a joke. Anyway, I put the phone down. So the next day, a box of 10 of my books arrived. And I opened the pack, and something looked strange. And I opened the pack, and there, with the spine turned the wrong way around, in among a pack of 10 of my books, was a single copy of Why Does E = MC Squared?
No. Come on. That's
I literally
amazing.
stood up, and I went against the back wall, and I suddenly had this sensation. I looked up, and Colette, I write about this kind of consciousness and all that, but I tell you, I got spooked.
Right.
I looked up and I said, who did that?
Who did that? You did that. You and the universe that is your partner.
This bizarre sense of consciousness that I wouldn't say to the average person who might think, you loved you loved your marbles. But I had this overwhelming sense of eyes and a sense of warmth and presence. It was incredible.
Wow, what a great story.
Weirdest things that's ever happened to me.
I love that story. So do you mind if we want to pull a card? Shall we ask the universe, what else does the universe want to reflect with you and I today about our conversation? And let's see if there's a subject that we want to tackle together. I'm just going to pull a card. I believe the consciousness of these cards. Ooh, imagine. Oh my goodness. This is the card, wow. Imagine. Ooh. So let's just quickly dive into the power of imagination, the right use of imagination. It's kind of what we've been talking about the whole time.
Yeah. Well, for me, what I use imagination most for actually isn't really to change aspects of my life. It's to help people to heal and to feel happier. That's how I use it, actually. I use visualization quite a lot when I'm trying to assist people in their recoveries.
I love that. So, okay, now I want to talk about that because you say that you use imagination or the concept of visualization when you work with other people. So, is it because of entanglement, going back to that saying that consciousness is shared, that we aren't really separate, that you can, like the power of prayer, that you can have a positive effect on that other person
Yeah,
by being curious and open? Would you say that's true?
yeah. So at the moment, I've when I was working on this book and I was immersed so much in the science, but also the spirituality, I had to remind myself that rather than just writing about what I believe about the healing arts, I part of me felt I need to start owning it myself and doing it more. I
Yeah.
know people that are sick that could do with a prayer, but maybe the kind of prayer that I would do with my belief that we are already connected and my
Right.
feeling sense of things. And so I've started to embrace that part of me much more than I ever have in my life. For me, what I've been trying to do is embrace that part of myself that believes in the magic of healing
Yeah.
and the fact if we're all entangled, then maybe, just maybe, sometimes my prayers done correctly with a heart of compassion and kindness and love, maybe they can have more of an effect than I've always scientifically thought they could, if
Right.
that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense because, I think what you've described is science being a kind of a container, like
Yeah,
trying to give it form, right? Like trying to give the form
yeah,
credibility or something. But it
yeah,
is limited. It limits it, right? Because
yeah,
the intellect
yeah,
limits it. But now you're
yeah,
leaving space for it to be filled with consciousness. And
yeah.
no, this is really interesting. Well, okay. As we move into an uncertain future, what do you think's missing from the world right now? And what do you think? Well, I know you're going to say kindness.
Yeah, well, I would say it's not missing. It's just I think the world would benefit if we made more of a big deal of kindness. If
Right.
we brought it to the surface, we started talking about it more. If
Uh-huh.
we you know practiced it more, but even let's have bigger conversations about kindness. And
Right.
I think it's not that it's missing from the world. I just think it is a remedy
Yeah.
that would help the world.
David, thank you so much for this today. For more information about David, his website is drdavidhamilton.com. David also has an awesome membership community called Personal Development Club. Tell me about that, David. You have live training videos, self-esteem tools, and live monthly lectures. What else do you got in there?
Well, that's what I do. Every month, I realized a few years ago that people wanted regular talks, in my communities and stuff. So I created Personal Development Club where I do a different live lecture every single month. And then we have a Q&A. I have a separate Q&A for anyone that has questions related to these kind of stuff. And I also put training videos on the website that are usually on a private website. They're usually in response to questions that people have asked in
Right.
the Q&A. So I go and we have core videos about the mind-body connection, self-esteem, kindness, spirituality, but usually in response to questions that people have. I go away and make a wee video, and it's permanently then hosted on the site, like a wee mini Netflix, if you will.
A wee mini Netflix, and I'm going to be signing up. That sounds fabulous. Amazing. Thank you, David. It was so wonderful to connect with you today. All right, everybody, this was Inside the Wooniverse. I'm your host, Colette Baron-Reid. That was Dr. David Hamilton, the awesome, awesome man of kindness. Until next time, be well. Okay, if you like this podcast and you want to see more, just click over here and you'll get to see more clips from this interview. If you just want to listen, well, if you click there, you'll listen to the entire interview available to you on any one of your favorite podcast channels.